Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.
Welcome back after a long summer pause to another edition of the Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, right at the start, because our listeners have an insatiable appetite for every detail of your life, what have you been up to over the summer?
What have I been up to over the summer? I'm not sure the listeners will be that interested, but I spent about a week in the United States, and then I was mainly in Somerset with a little time in Kent, where my mother-in-law lives. So
but you didn't see Steve Bannon either in the United States or in Somerset?
I didn't see Mr. Bannon either in the United States or in Somerset. I did do an event for Conservatives Abroad whilst I was in New York, which I was very glad to do, a very good organisation that it is.
Talking of Somerset, how many new members has your association had over the last year?
Not an enormous number, 20 or 30, that sort of thing.
You can see why I'm asking. I've been asking every Conservative MP I can find, because before we get into a broader conversation about Chequers and the ERG and the coming party conference and all that, there was all this fuss and flummery over the summer about Conservative membership and whether it was rising rapidly, because of a push from Leave.EU, or whether, as the party chairman claims, CCHQ can take much of the credit, or whether right-wing Conservatives who might have drifted away from the party are rejoining anyway. What do you think?
I think that CCHQ, Central Office, deserves some credit for having a membership campaign. I think that's important. I don't think the numbers, however, are so great that there's anything much in it at all. I think there are a few people joining the Conservative Party. That's very good news. But we're a long way from being the mass membership party of 2 million that we were in previous decades. So I think this is just a fairly normal level. There's more interest in politics at the moment. Politics is important. I don't see any signs of entryism.
Have you talked to your colleagues about that? Because I have done some ringing around, and in one association near my old area in High Wycombe, there were 100 new members in quite a well-supported association. Down somewhere in another home county, there were 100 in an association of about 600. I had another similar figure for an association near that. These are quite big numbers, and they don't seem to be fantastically atypical.
100 isn't a huge number, I don't think. And is there any evidence for entryism? And what is the entryism trying to do?
I hadn't mentioned entryism at this stage. I was just saying there does seem to have been some quite large signings up in some places.
Politics is more interesting than it has been. I think that's the main reason people are signing up, and perhaps people are seeing that the Labour Party's got lots of members and that they feel that therefore they ought to join the party they support because they don't want Jeremy Corbyn to have it all his own way.
And just to pick you up on something I think you said over the summer, you yourself said you wouldn't welcome a directed campaign by Leave.EU to sign people up.
No, I wouldn't. I think that you don't want an organisation to try and take over the Conservative Party, whatever that organisation may be. I think that would be to the disadvantage of the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party needs to remain a broad church with a wide spread of membership. It oughtn't to be under factional control, and factions oughtn't seek to take it under their control.
Just a question to follow that up and bring this bit of the conversation to a close. I mean, how do you know who's joining up for a particular narrow purpose and who isn't? This isn't a party that's ever vetted people for ideology or ideas. It's rather difficult to do. It's arguably extremely undesirable. So if you put that aside, how do you find out who's joined for a particular narrow purpose and who has not?
You don't. You look at the numbers and the structure of the party. The numbers are not sufficient for anybody to take it over, but the structure of the party is that members are in control of their local associations. They're not in control of the party nationally. That has lots of safeguards built in to prevent it being taken over by a narrow group. And the only direct vote that party members have is for a new leader, but they only vote for one of two candidates put forward by the members of Parliament. So you have to say, if this were an entryist thing, first of all, it's not very successful because the numbers aren't anything like big enough. But secondly, there's no real purpose to it because they can't control who the MPs put forward in the leadership election when that eventually comes, and there's bound to be one at some point in the long history of the Tory party. And so it's not really achieving anything. So I don't think you need to worry too much. That's my basic view. We get 100 new members in an association. That's great. There's nothing for them in that sense to take over other than running the local association, which is important and is the grassroots campaigning, but it's not where the policy of the Conservative Party is set.
I just thought we'd have a run through that before turning to more up-to-date events, such as this ERG document. We were told last week that there would be a document published over the weekend. I was actually arranging a piece on our site for a certain day. It didn't appear. Why was that?
Well, it's a question of focus. And the issue here is that most of what we wanted to say is perfectly obvious. That I was really struck by the Brexit Select Committee meeting last week with Michel Barnier, where he said what is on offer is a very comprehensive free trade deal and that Chequers isn't workable from their point of view, in so many words. And therefore it became clear that actually you didn't need a long document. You just needed to say the EU is offering us Canada Plus, for want of a better term, its best ever free trade deal. There is one obstacle, and the one obstacle is Northern Ireland. And so you need to look at that, not from our point of view. From the UK's point of view, the solution to Northern Ireland has always been very straightforward. We will not put up a border. Full stop. Challenge the EU and the Irish government to put up a border. But what we want to do is to look at how you solve the problem from the EU's point of view. What precedents are there in the EU's behaviour elsewhere to allow for sensible solutions? What do EU regulations permit, and what is the problem that the EU is seeking to solve? And when you look at this in the context of a free trade agreement, which has been offered without either tariffs or quotas, then a number of the problems begin to fall away because that's dealt with by the free trade agreement. And so you're beginning to look at the problems that haven't fallen away and how do you solve those. And if you can do that, if our Northern Ireland paper, which will be launched later this week, can answer that question, then you've got the Canada deal that is already on the table, and you've got the solution to Northern Ireland, and therefore you've got a very realistic way of leaving the European Union that I think almost everybody could accept.
That section of the document will be launched later this week.
That's right.
This is a section that Owen Paterson and David Davis, among others, have been working on.
That's correct.
And so there won't be any larger document. You've binned the idea of doing that, in effect.
That's what's happening later this week, and that should answer most of the thoughts. There are lots of documents coming out that we are linked to. I will be joining Economists for Free Trade tomorrow with a policy document on what happens in the event of no deal, what the economic consequences are. And that is not formally an ERG document, but it represents a view that is held by many members of the ERG. As you mentioned in your piece today, the IEA will be coming out with a piece on trade, and that actually drawing all of these together with the possibility being offered by the EU and an answer to the Irish question provides a very comprehensive view of where we would like to go.
But you're not now planning a larger ERG document on Canada Plus Plus Plus?
Well, there will be further things that come out from the ERG, but we are not planning a document that is calling for a Star Wars shield or all sorts of funny things like that got reported.
Is that in the draft?
There was a comment on that in an early draft, but that was not ever an ERG policy, because that's nothing to do with the ERG. That's not what we're there to do. We're there to focus on the European question.
Would suggesting a Falklands expeditionary force with money that we didn't have to pay to the EU because there wasn't a deal, would that be out of bounds?
I think that goes well beyond what the ERG is there to do. It's one thing to say that there may be extra money for defence, and in an uncertain world that is necessary. We have to be very careful with this, because you don't want to spend the money twice. You know, that it's something that you've seen lots of organisations do over the years. You remember the Lib Dems were going to put 1 penny on income tax, and that was then going to be spent many times over. UKIP at one point were going to spend the overseas aid budget on practically everything that you could think of. And there's always a danger. You identify one saving, you spend it on more than one thing. And anything that we suggest has to be highly focused. And in some ways, it's better to identify the saving and then leave people to argue about where the saving could be directed.
There are two outcomes here that tend to get blurred. One is successful Canada plus type arrangement. The other is no deal. The ERG is not planning a big document on what no deal would be like.
Well, no deal is something that we don't need to be afraid of. And I think the Economist for Free Trade paper tomorrow will be really helpful on explaining the background to that and to trading on WTO terms. Because no deal isn't really no deal. It's a WTO deal, which is already in place, already there, and there are considerable international agreements around that.
Let's step back for a minute and take a look at the big picture. We've talked about Canada plus. We've touchingly glanced on no deal. But what's actually on the table from the government is the Chequers proposal. So we have the Chequers proposal, so we have party conference coming up, so we have the negotiations. In very broad terms, where do you think all this is going?
Well, Mr. Barnier was very interesting on the Chequers proposals and the white paper. He did his best to be tactful. He said there are some good bits of the white paper, but the facilitated customs agreement and the common rule book are simply unacceptable to the European Union. And that's the overwhelming bulk of the proposal of Chequers. So Chequers is in real difficulties, and it would be hard to see how Michel Barnier could do a U-turn from that whilst remaining as the chief negotiator. That if the council said to him, no, you've got to accept this, I think his position would be absurd. He's been so clear he would have to resign, I think. The EU sometimes works in strange ways. And I think the Canada-style free trade deal offers the Prime Minister a way out of a difficulty essentially of her own making. That everyone was happy up to the Mansion House speech. There were compromises within that, but both sides of the party could live with that. If the Prime Minister were head back towards that, and that is basically free trade with some add-ons of cooperation within various agencies, then I think there's a solution. If the Prime Minister continues with Chequers, I don't see how she gets it through the House of Commons.
I can see why Barnier is unhappy with the customs arrangement, because it involves us, in effect, doing part of their work, which they don't want us to do. Why is he unhappy with the common rule book, given that this would be the common rule book that they write?
I think partly because it separates goods and services, and partly because it doesn't have all of the four freedoms. So there's the free movement problem, and there's the cutting out of services.
So he's actually, as far as you can see, satisfied with the element on manufacturers. He just wants to extend it to services and get free movement in, and hey presto.
The EU's position seems to be quite clear. You can either be in the customs union, the single market, or not. And if you're in it in toto. And it was fascinating listening to Mr. Barnier, because he thinks that the single market and the customs union are almost a divine creation and wonderful things of the EU, and the virtues of being in the EU, and therefore you have to take everything on to be in it. I think the single market and customs union and the work of Beelzebub, and that therefore being out of it altogether is what we want. But both of us come to the conclusion that you're either in it or you're out of it, and you can't just pick and mix. I want to be out of it because I think that's in our national interest, to be free of a inefficient, high-cost, economically unsuitable regulatory and customs arrangement. He wants us to be completely in it because he thinks this is the finest achievement of the European Union.
There's no sign at all of Downing Street backing off Chequers, as far as I can see, and I may be wrong, but I'd be surprised even if they do it before conference, because that would be a climb down, and if you're the Prime Minister or the leader of the party, you don't want to go to the party conference having climbed down. You climb down afterwards. So I'm presuming that she will make her case for Chequers at the conference. What I want to do now is look ahead and imagine what happens if there's a vote based on Chequers. What I mean by that is, if there's a vote, as I understand it, we will be asked to pay over £40 billion in exchange for a pretty vague political trade security declaration. It may be based on Chequers, it may be Chequers minus with elements of free trade thrown in. It could even conceivably be based on Canada. At that point, the Commons is going to be asked to vote for something that's pretty vague in exchange for handing over 40 billion quid, which is the sort of issue of which voters who don't follow all the arcana get seized. 40 billion quid is quite a lot of money.
Yeah,
What do you think is going to happen?
I think your analysis leads to a very clear conclusion. Parliament will not vote £40 billion for a lick and a promise. It's just not what is going to happen. How could the Labour Party justify to its voters spending £40 billion for what is reported to be a 10-page vague document? It's £4 billion a page. It's the budget of the Ministry of Defence for a year. I mean, you can't just fritter away 40 billion, which is, money is our strongest negotiating card for the rest of the deal, for nothing. And who would vote for that?
Isn't what Downing Street is up to is this. Downing Street believes that in the event of this vote, this will be what's on the table. MPs will be concerned that if they don't vote for it, there will be a chaotic no deal, or somehow Brexit will be reversed. Now, in those circumstances, Downing Street will think you won't get anything like 80 members of the ERG voting against the deal, and I suspect Downing Street is right. But you don't need 80, even 20, and the thing would go down. So therefore, the Prime Minister's relying on Liberal Democrat, other party and anti-Corbyn, pro-Brexit Labour votes to get this through, isn't she?
You were beginning to sound like Abraham negotiating with God over the citizen of the plain, and Abraham says, if there are 50 just men, what will you do? And 40, and it gets down to 10. The Conservative numbers are definitely there to vote against Chequers, assuming the opposition opposes it. I think the Prime Minister is in really dangerous territory if she decides to split the party over paying £40 billion of taxpayers' money for no proper concluded deal. And I think it would be a really unwise thing to do and would not be in the interest of either the Conservative Party or the nation.
Just remind me when Downing Street was negotiating with Labour MPs before about this. There was a fuss and a stir earlier this year when Conservative MPs were due to go in over something, and it was found out that Downing Street had arranged meetings with Labour MPs that I think were cancelled.
There was some fuss about that, that's quite right. I don't think they were cancelled, I think they were held by different people. And so this was immediately after Chequers.
Yes. Right, exactly. So in other words, it looks highly likely that if the Prime Minister's been approaching Labour MPs before, and I can see the logic of it in terms of Commons votes, there's no reason why she shouldn't do it again.
She can try, of course. I think it'd be quite hard for Labour MPs to justify their constituents spending £40 billion for nothing. And what people in my position have to do is to say, well, look, there is an alternative, and that is the Canada Plus style deal that the EU has offered us, and that doesn't require having no idea of what you're paying money for. I think there is a strong argument for paying money to leave the EU smoothly and well. And that 40 billion is not an unreasonable amount in that context. But we have to know what we're getting. And if we were getting Canada Plus in return for the 40 billion, I'd be happy to vote for that. If we don't know what we're getting, and it's just a vague promise, I simply don't think that's a respectable thing for the government to offer to Parliament. I don't think it'd be constitutionally proper to ask for expenditure of that kind with no detail as to what the money is being spent on.
If I was sitting here and I were the Prime Minister and I was saying to you that
if you were the Prime Minister, we wouldn't be in this problem, but never mind.
We'd probably be in worse. If I was to say to you, I'm going to rely on Labour votes to get this thing through, what would you say to me?
I would say that is not something a Conservative Prime Minister should plan to do.
How dangerous are the consequences in your view?
I think it's the most divisive thing you can do to a party because the numbers are likely to be quite large. It's not going to be 2 or 3 Labour MPs needing to do this. It's going to be a large number to counteract the significant number of Conservative MPs who will vote against Chequers at any price.
Could it presage a bigger split? And once you have members of one party voting with another, once it's been done on a certain subject, if it's done more than once, you can see how things begin to change on the floor of the Commons.
Well, that's the history of the 1840s, isn't it? And that's what we've kept on coming back to, and Peel and the repeal of the Corn Laws. The problem with this analogy is that Peel was right and Chequers is wrong, and that Chequers is about protectionism and keeping the economy inefficient, whereas the Corn Laws were about opening up and free markets. But yeah, you do get into interesting and recently uncharted political territory. I think it was a really foolish thing to do, but I would have thought the least likely thing for the Prime Minister to be able to get Labour votes on side for is to give £40 billion away for nothing. How do they defend that to their constituents?
Of course, in the 1970s, when entering the common market was at stake, cross-party voting did make it possible,
It did
and
indeed.
the parties didn't split, although it can be argued that what happened then paved the way for the split that became the SDP.
You're absolutely spot on, aren't you? That Roy Jenkins led a group to support Ted Heath in 1971, which outnumbered the then relatively small number of anti-marketeers who voted against Ted Heath. I think this has had long-standing consequences on both parties. The Labour Party did split, and it split over Europe because the policy of Michael Foot in 1983 was to leave the common market. And the Conservative Party has been suffering the consequences of its row on Europe ever since. So I don't think the 1971 precedent is a happy one for either party.
Can I ask you, I've come last to the thing everyone else has put first, which is Boris Johnson. I mean, what effect is all this hullabaloo having on the debate about Chequers, if any?
Well, I think it's important because Boris cuts through in a way other people don't. So his argument against Chequers is getting through to the electorate. It has to be said, helped by Downing Street's PR machine, which always seems to highlight particular words in his articles, which then ensures that everybody gets to hear about them rather than merely the readers of the Telegraph, in this case the Mail on Sunday.
You don't think, by the way, Downing Street was behind the interventions of Alistair Burt and Duncan yesterday?
Well, they're bound by collective responsibility. They can only speak for the government. They can't speak as individuals.
So your view is they were speaking for the government when they said what they said on Twitter?
The Prime Minister said at Chequers that she was reasserting collective responsibility over European policy. I believe what the Prime Minister says. They can't just fire off willy-nilly. They have to make statements that are government statements. That is therefore government policy, or else they should resign.
You think their statements were cleared in advance?
Well, they jolly well should have been.
And if they weren't, we must presume that they were speaking for the government, according to your view, because they've not been fired.
That's right. These become government statements, and they're brilliant because they boost the profile of Boris Johnson's incisive comments.
And coming back to the main question again, so you've had the comments, you've had this reaction which you think was licensed deliberately or otherwise.
It must have been. It was also absurd overreaction.
And what difference would it all have made among the colleagues then to their view of Chequers, if any? Never mind the public for a section, or party members. What about the colleagues?
Well, there are mixed views on Chequers within the Parliamentary Party. And it's very interesting that people like Justine Greening and Nick Bowles have come to the conclusion that Chequers doesn't work, and they're not close to the ERG. There are one or two people close to the ERG who think Chequers does work. So there are mixed views, but I think the general view is that Chequers is not a complete answer. It was very interesting. People have focused on Boris's article in the Mail on Sunday, but I think they should have focused on Jeremy Hunt's article in the Mail on Sunday, because he was ostensibly writing a defence of Chequers, but it hardly defended Chequers. And it gave a very Eurosceptic tone to his comments. Now, I think that's important because he's obviously a Foreign Secretary.
He placed a lot of stress on the unacceptability of free movement in his piece, didn't he?
Which is the one thing that would unlock Chequers.
And one way of reading it would have been that he was putting down a marker against any further concession on free movement, but I could be imagining things.
I think he was putting down a very clear marker, but again, we could both ask him. Both have vivid imaginations. But I thought it was a really important article, a statement by the Foreign Secretary of where he stands on this, which was not a ringing endorsement of Chequers. And if even the Foreign Secretary is not giving it a ringing endorsement, how much real support is there?
I wondered in this way. I've been a Conservative MP and know probably more than I should, even though a lot of my knowledge is out of date, sometimes how they think. And there is a category of Conservative MP that looks at Boris Johnson and they think, he's being paid more than me, he's getting more sex than me, and he doesn't know who I am. And anything he says in his columns in the Daily Telegraph riles me and drives me up the wall. This is not a helpful environment when one's trying, from your point of view, helpfully and dispassionately to consider Chequers.
People always have their various reasons for liking or disliking other individuals. And yes, Boris has been subject to some envy from some quarters. That's clearly true. But I think by and large, most Tory MPs want a solution to leaving the European Union. They want the Tory party to remain united, and they want a sense of direction about where we're going. And that is the key over and above individual personalities. Oh, and they want to win the next election, which is quite important.
I mean, just finally, I'm bound to ask you this. If I don't, other people will, so I might as well on the record. They'll look at you and say, Jacob Rees-Mogg, staunch Catholic upholder of traditional morality, how can you go around defending this serial adulterer?
Judge not that ye be not judged.
There we are. Thank you very much for another edition of the Moggcast, and we'll be back in the run-up to party conference to talk more about Chequers and Canada and No Deal.
Indeed we will. I look forward to it.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.